Okay, I am here with my mom, Katherine Carlson, and we're here to talk about the Bush-Dukakis, the tank image, and the period of the 1988 election and issues of revolving around this. So our first question is, what was life like in the 1980s from your perspective? What were the big issues of the time, like political issues, economic issues, and social issues that you can remember?
Okay, so the 1980s were when I was in my 20s. I graduated from college in 1983. And it was a very exciting and challenging time. The beginning of the decade saw enormous inflation. Like I remember getting out of college and looking at interest rates of 14, 15, 16%. It was also a time of a lot of wars. The Iran-Iraq War, for example, started in 1980 and finished in 1988. The Americans were being blown up all over the world. The Beirut Army barracks had been blown up in 1983. Pan Am was blown up over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1986. And then, of course, you had all of the events that led up to the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989.
Okay, so now I would like you to describe the most significant issue of the last decade in a maximum of 4 words.
I'd say challenging, exciting, promising, and difficult.
Do you remember the context of this picture and what election it was associated with?
Yeah, Michael Dukakis. So Michael Dukakis was running for president after 2 terms of Reagan, so he was running against H.W. Bush. And he wanted to portray that he was a big supporter of the military, which I guess he felt that he had to be as a presidential contender. So everybody made fun of him because he was wearing a helmet. He looked like like a dwarf, I guess, running around playing with the big boys and the big bad tanks, and was subject to much ridicule by the press and by many people. I thought it was kind of a stupid issue. I like my politics a little bit more nuanced than one image.
So how old were you at the time of this image?
27.
And where were you living?
I was living in Jamaica Plain.
Do you remember what role this picture played in the election?
I think it was pretty powerful. I think it was pretty important to a lot of low information voters.
When the election took place, what was the general sentiment about the candidates? For example, how did you see the candidates? What type of people did they portray themselves as?
Well, we had on the one hand we had Mike Dukakis, who was a very successful governor here in Massachusetts. He had claimed that he was responsible for what was called the Massachusetts Miracle, if I remember correctly, where we actually had some good employment rates and had turned the state around from a place where people fled to a place where people actually wanted to stay and live. My interpretation of that was that Proposition 2.5 had something to do with that too, but that's maybe outside the scope of the presidential the presidential candidates. On the other hand, we had George H.W. Bush, who had just finished up 2 terms of being a vice president under Reagan, who was a former CIA director, who had significant military experience during World War II, I believe. And coming on the heels of some significant foreign policy challenges, I think the overall sentiment was that Bush was a needed stronger presence than Dukakis, whose strengths lay more, as I said, in the more local, smaller state endeavors. Who was also very strong on education and social policy.
Do you remember Willie Horton?
Yes.
How did he play a role in the election?
There had been a policy that was established. I don't know if it was just in Massachusetts or it was across the country, but it was to allow people who were serving time in jail to have furloughs. So they were allowed to leave the prison after good behavior and go home, I guess, for a weekend or a couple of days or something. And apparently Willie Horton was one of these people, and he was actually a convicted murderer, as I recall, and when he was allowed to go home on furlough, he killed somebody very brutally. And that was found out and used to portray Dukakis as soft on crime.
Okay, do you remember any of the political advertisements of the time?
Not too well, no.
Okay. Here, this is an advertisement based off of the image I showed you earlier.
Michael Dukakis has opposed virtually every defense system we developed. He opposed new aircraft carriers. He opposed anti-satellite weapons. He opposed 4 missile systems, including the Pershing II missile deployment. Dukakis opposed the stealth bomber and a ground emergency warning system against nuclear attack. He even criticized our rescue mission to Grenada and our strike on Libya. And now he wants to be our commander-in-chief. America can't afford that risk.
What do you think of this advertisement?
It's very effective.
Does it go well along with the picture?
Its strength is playing into opposites. So when you have someone who's opposed to investment in the military, and then shows up riding around in a tank, you get the feeling that that person is not really serious about what he believes.
Okay. And the other advertisement I have to show you has to do with our lovely friend Willie Horton.
As governor, Michael Dukakis vetoed mandatory sentences for drug dealers. He vetoed the death penalty. His revolving door prison policy gave weekend furloughs to first-degree murderers not eligible for parole. While out, many committed other crimes like kidnapping and rape, and many are still at large. Now Michael Dukakis says he wants to do for America what he's done for Massachusetts. America can't afford that risk.
That wasn't really about Willie Horton.
Well, it was the furloughs and the same thought.
Yeah. So actually, that was very interesting. What struck me was that they talked about the furlough program, and then they said 268 people escaped. 268 escaped. It's very direct and very blunt. I know that ad had been criticized as being racist. What I observed just now is that almost all of the men going in and out of the gate were white. So I'm a little confused as to why that was called a racist ad.
That ad, I believe, had a huge impact on the election. Do you see why? And do you remember it at all?
I think that people are very afraid of they're very afraid of evil people. And certainly Willie Horton was an evil person, and they don't understand why, when someone is convicted as a murderer, why that person should be allowed out of jail before his or her term is finished. I think that today some of the argument about the death penalty for the Boston bomber revolved around that issue in particular, with some arguing for the death penalty because they were afraid that at some point in the future he would be released.
So during the time of the Bush-Dukakis election, what do you remember to be the most prominent political issues of the time?
Well, at that point, I had just gotten back from a concert tour of Romania and Bulgaria, and had seen things that really changed my view of the world. I had gone over, I think, probably as someone who was slightly agnostic, but after having seen on the ground what was going on in both Romania and Bulgaria, and then having traveled by myself through Czechoslovakia and Poland, I was very interested in having someone that would continue American policies in respect to the Soviet Union. Other people, I think, at that time were more swayed by the type of ads that you just showed me, so crime, for example, or military investment. Yeah.
Did you watch any of the televised debates?
No.
Overall, how do you think the picture and the videos that I showed you affected the outcome of the election?
Apparently they were very successful because George H.W. Bush won.
Do you know of any short or long-term impacts? Obviously short, Bush won, but any long-term impacts of the election, of the picture?
Long-term impacts of the picture. Well, I think that this election was perhaps one of the turning points in how election campaigns kept going in the future. There were a lot of negative advertising, and I think that Dukakis tried to hold up the high road and tried to ignore these, but in later years he said that that was a loser's philosophy, and he would not have done the same thing. That winning became more important than staying away from negative advertising. I personally think that's to the detriment of political life, but it seems to be here with us.
What is your personal opinion on the overall issue regarding on how an image can have such a large effect on an election? Well,
I only read, I don't watch images, so maybe I'm the wrong person to ask. People do say that an image is worth 1,000 words, and it's maybe more effective for communicating with people who are not interested in delving deeper into the issues behind the faces.